The morning sun had barely risen over Silvercrest Estates when the first metallic clink of a hammer echoed across the quiet cul-de-sac. It was soft, rhythmic, almost careful, nothing like the chaotic blare of construction work. But in a neighborhood ruled by the HOA like a strict monarchy, even a whisper of renovation noise was enough to trigger alarms. From behind trimmed hedges and spotless driveways, blinds shifted, silhouettes appeared, and murmurs traveled across freshly paved sidewalks. And at the center of all this attention stood Keanu Reeves, dressed in worn jeans, black boots, and a faded cotton tee, kneeling on the ground with a drill in hand. No cameras, no assistants, no movie set. Just him, a stack of lumber, and the early outline of what looked like a wooden frame. By 8:05 a.m., the HOA president, Margaret Hawthorne, marched down the street like a judge delivering a verdict. Her clipboard slapped against her side, her heels clicked with military precision, and her lips were pinched into a thin, disapproving line. Residents described her as dedicated. Keanu quietly called her consistent. She stopped at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, her shadow falling over the lumber pile like a storm cloud. "Mr. Reeves," she declared, "this constitutes an unauthorized structural modification. Article 14, Section 3 of the Silvercrest Residential Standards clearly prohibits exterior construction without formal HOA approval." Her tone was cold, rehearsed, and unshakably confident, delivered with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. Keanu looked up slowly, resting one knee on the ground, wiping a streak of sawdust from his palms. No frustration, no pushback, just a calm, measured breath. "It's not a major structure," he said quietly, "just a small project to help someone out." But his explanation only seemed to harden Margaret's stance. She leaned over the half-built frame, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. Any project altering the visual uniformity of the homes is considered major. That includes ramps, decks, patios, or any modification with permanent structural anchoring. Her eyes narrowed as she added, "This is non-compliant. You are hereby notified to stop work immediately." She tore a bright red violation notice from her pad and clipped it onto his temporary workbench, the paper fluttering in the breeze like a public flag of shame. What Margaret didn't see, or didn't care to look for, was the reason behind Keanu's determination. Across the street, at the corner house shaded by an aging elm, lived Mrs. Eleanor Whitford, a 78-year-old widow whose wheelchair barely fit through her front door, let alone down the steep three-step drop to her driveway. Her husband, a retired postal worker, had passed away 4 years ago, leaving her with fading photographs, a quiet house, and a mobility condition that had slowly worsened. In recent months, she had begun missing doctor appointments because neighbors weren't always home to help lift her wheelchair down the steps. Keanu had watched her struggle one afternoon, hands trembling as she attempted to maneuver down the top stair, and something inside him clenched. He had stepped forward that day, helped her safely, and silently promised he'd find a better solution. Margaret didn't know that the construction noise she was so eager to eliminate was actually Keanu building Eleanor a gently sloped, fully compliant ramp, one he had drafted from architectural guides and accessibility standards. She didn't know about the nights he spent sketching angles, calculating load capacity, or checking ADA guidelines to ensure her safety. She didn't know that the ramp wasn't for him, but for a woman who had never asked him for anything. All Margaret saw was a rule being broken. All Keanu saw was someone who needed help. And between those two opposing visions, the battle lines of a new conflict had been drawn, not dramatic, not loud, but deeply human and painfully avoidable. As Margaret turned and walked away, the violation notice rustled in the wind. Keanu picked it up slowly, studying it with the same thoughtful expression he used when analyzing a script. No anger, just a quiet, disappointed exhale. He folded the paper carefully, set it aside, and looked across the street toward Eleanor's house. Her curtains moved slightly, a gentle, worried gesture from someone who knew he was doing this for her. Keanu gave a small, reassuring nod. He wasn't going to stop, not because he was defying the HOA, but because someone needed a ramp more than the neighborhood needed uniformity. And that simple truth was enough for him to pick up the drill again, knowing this fight was only just beginning. The HOA's community center looked harmless from the outside. White walls, trimmed bushes, a little fountain that pretended the neighborhood was peaceful. But inside, the place felt like a courtroom disguised as a conference room. A long rectangular table dominated the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs that squeaked every time someone shifted. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the stack of binders labeled Compliance, Architectural Review, and Violations, Active. On this particular morning, that last binder sat directly in front of HOA President Margaret Hawthorne, its corner already bent from how aggressively she had opened it. Margaret adjusted her glasses and tapped her pen against the table, a sharp, rhythmic snap that matched the irritation on her face. To her right sat Trevor, the neighborhood's self-appointed security liaison, a man who took pride in reporting grass that grew a half-inch too high. Across from him was Linda, the treasurer, who spent most meetings calculating fines faster than anyone could propose alternatives. The three made up the enforcement committee, and today's agenda had only one item: Keanu Reeves' unauthorized construction. Margaret opened the meeting with her usual authority. We have a homeowner engaging in structural modification without submitting Form 14B or requesting architectural approval. As documented, this is a clear violation. She slid photos across the table. Keanu working, wood stacked, the half-built ramp. A visual indictment. Trevor leaned forward, squinting at the images as if he were analyzing evidence from a crime scene. "Yeah, I've seen him working for days," he said. "Looks like some sort of platform. Could be a deck, could be a ramp. We don't allow ramps unless they meet aesthetic guidelines." He paused, then added with unnecessary suspicion, "You think he's building it for himself?" Margaret's jaw tightened. Regardless of intent, it must be approved. We cannot allow precedent-setting exceptions. Once one person starts modifying externally, others will follow. Linda nodded but hesitated, her voice softer than the others. "We could ask what it's for. If it's medical, we should consider." Margaret sliced the air with her hand. "We enforce rules, Linda. We are not a charity. And besides," she tapped the photo again, "he didn't ask. That alone warrants disciplinary action." Outside the room, unaware of the discussion, Keanu had just helped Eleanor down one of her front steps, something that took patience, strength, and gentleness. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the wheelchair's armrests. "You're too kind, dear," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Keanu smiled softly. "You don't owe me anything, Eleanor. Let's get you to your appointment safely." As he guided her toward the car, he glanced back at the ramp in progress. It wasn't pretty yet, just lumber and potential, but he could already picture the finished slope, the rails reinforced with steel brackets, the smooth surface coating that would keep her from slipping even in the rain. He was building dignity, independence, and safety, not a violation. And he was willing to face whatever pushback came next to make sure she had it. Back at the HOA meeting, the situation escalated. Margaret flipped to the fine section and circled a number with bold, aggressive strokes. "We impose an immediate $200 non-compliance penalty, plus a daily $75 fee until construction ceases. If Mr. Reeves continues, we escalate to formal legal action." Linda's eyes widened. Legal action? Against Keanu Reeves? Over a ramp? But Trevor supported Margaret, nodding vigorously. "If you make an exception for a celebrity, the whole system collapses." Margaret exhaled, satisfied. "Good. Then it's settled." She closed the binder with a sharp thud and stood, ready to deliver the notice like a sheriff serving a warrant. None of them had considered there might be a human reason behind the lumber in his driveway. None of them had asked who the ramp was for. They were too focused on rules, structure, uniformity, anything but compassion. At the exact moment Margaret marched out of the community center, Keanu was gently placing Eleanor's wheelchair into his car. He heard the sound of heels clicking across the pavement long before he saw her. When he turned, she was already halfway up his driveway, clutching a new stack of papers. Her expression was triumphant, as if she had caught him doing something scandalous. "Mr. Reeves," she said loudly, "you will need to stop work immediately. Further activity will result in escalating penalties." She handed him the envelope. Keanu took it calmly, but the weight of it pressed against his chest. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. Instead, he simply asked, "Do you ever consider why someone might build something like this?" Margaret stiffened. Intent is irrelevant. Rules are rules. She turned and left without another word. Keanu watched her go, the papers crumpling slightly in his hand. Behind him, Eleanor looked down, guilt clouding her eyes. "I don't want to be the cause of trouble for you," she whispered. Keanu shook his head, voice steady. "You're not causing trouble, Eleanor. You deserve to move safely in and out of your home." He placed the envelope on the passenger seat beside her. "And I'm not done helping you. Not yet." As he started the car, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. This conflict wasn't about wood, nails, or bylaws. It was about humanity versus rigidity, compassion versus control. And he knew which side he was on, even if it cost him. The drive to the clinic was quiet, not because Keanu and Eleanor lacked things to say, but because neither wanted to speak through the weight sitting between them. The violation notice lay folded in the cup holder, the red header still visible like a warning flare. Eleanor kept glancing at it, her hands fidgeting with the blanket on her lap. Finally, halfway down Maple Ridge Road, she broke the silence. "Keanu, this ramp, it isn't worth all that trouble. I've lived like this for years. I can manage." Keanu shook his head gently, eyes still on the road. "You shouldn't have to manage. You should be able to leave your home without asking 5 people for help." His tone wasn't angry, it was resolute, quiet, and deeply human. If they understood what you go through, they wouldn't be talking about fines. By the time they arrived at the clinic, the parking lot was filling up with morning patients. Keanu parked close to the entrance and walked around to lift the wheelchair from the trunk. Eleanor watched him, her eyes soft but sad. "You know, David used to do this for me," she said, referring to her late husband. "He always said he'd build me a ramp when my legs started giving out. But then the cancer came." Her voice wavered. Keanu stopped, met her gaze, and gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "He loved you. I'm sure he would have built you the safest ramp in the world." She smiled faintly, the memory both comforting and painful. "I just never imagined a day would come when someone else would do what he couldn't finish." Keanu knelt to adjust her footrests. "I'm not replacing him, Eleanor. Just keeping his promise alive." As he pushed her inside, 2 nurses approached, their faces lighting up. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for bringing her again," one said. "She always insists she doesn't need help, but we know better." The nurses exchanged sympathetic glances when they saw the way Eleanor clutched her blanket, a familiar sign of elderly patients trying not to show vulnerability. As they checked her in, the front desk receptionist leaned over and lowered her voice. "You're a good man for doing this. Most people don't go this far for neighbors." Keanu simply nodded. He didn't see it as kindness. He saw it as the bare minimum a decent human could do. But as he stepped aside to get her a cup of water, the thought lingered, how is the HOA so blind to this? The answer was obvious. They never looked. They enforced rules, not lives. While Eleanor was taken in for her appointment, Keanu sat in the waiting room, scrolling through the HOA documents Margaret had left. Page after page of rigid regulations, formatting guidelines, architectural specifications, color codes, yet not a single line about medical exemptions, mobility necessities, or compassionate consideration for elderly residents. The system wasn't broken, it was built without humanity in mind. His jaw tightened as he read the justification for the fines, maintaining uniform aesthetics. 3 pages of rules just so a neighborhood could look symmetrical from the street. He closed the folder and exhaled sharply. The ramp wasn't an eyesore. It wasn't a hazard. It wasn't even visible from a main road unless someone went out of their way to look. The only thing a ramp disrupted was the HOA's obsession with control. When Eleanor's appointment ended, Keanu wheeled her back to the car. On the drive home, she seemed more tired than usual. "My doctor says I'll need physical therapy 3 times a week," she murmured. 3 times. And each time, these steps. Her voice drifted off as she imagined the steep drop at her front door. Keanu tightened his grip on the steering wheel. That ramp wasn't optional anymore. It was necessary. When they arrived at her house, he helped her through the doorway and up the treacherous first stair. Her hands trembled more today. Her breathing was shallow from the effort. Watching her struggle ignited something fierce in him, a protective determination sharper than anger. He resolved one thing with absolute clarity. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I'm finishing that ramp. They can't stop me." Across the street, unnoticed by them, a figure watched from behind drawn blinds. Not Margaret. Not Trevor. It was Mr. Nolan, a retired carpenter and long-time resident. He had heard the commotion earlier. He had seen the violation notice being posted. And now, he had watched Keanu struggle to help Eleanor up the steps. When Keanu stepped off her porch, chest heaving, Nolan opened his blinds a little wider, his expression changing from confusion to understanding, and then to something else, resolve. Because the truth was no longer hidden. Someone else in the neighborhood had finally seen who the ramp was for. Someone who knew the HOA was about to pick a fight far bigger than they realized. And he wasn't about to let Keanu face it alone. The next morning, Silvercrest Estates buzzed with attention that felt alive. Word traveled faster than any notice the HOA could print. Some residents whispered disapproval. Rules are rules, they said. Others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure but uncomfortable with how far the HOA had gone. But a quiet subset of neighbors, those who had lived long enough to remember what community truly meant, watched Keanu's driveway with new understanding. Among them was Mr. Nolan, the retired carpenter who had seen everything the previous afternoon. Before sunrise, he walked across the street with a slow but determined stride, a thermos of coffee in one hand and his old tool belt slung over his shoulder. Keanu was already outside, clearing sawdust and arranging the lumber, when he heard the gravel crunch under Nolan's boots. He looked up, surprised but grateful. "Morning," Nolan said, voice rough from age but steady. "Saw what you were doing yesterday, and saw how hard it was getting Eleanor up those steps." He paused, resting a hand on the unfinished ramp frame. "You're doing the right thing, and I'd like to help." Keanu blinked, unexpectedly moved. This wasn't charity, it was solidarity. "You don't have to get involved," he replied quietly. But Nolan shook his head. "Son, there's things worth getting involved in. An old woman's safety is one of them. And besides," he tapped the wood gently, "your angle here is off by 2 degrees. That ramp'll be too steep." Keanu let out a small laugh. "Then I definitely need your help." As the two men worked, something remarkable began happening. One by one, a few more residents stepped onto their porches and watched. First was Mrs. Delgado, a soft-spoken widow whose husband had been wheelchair-bound for years before he passed. She approached with a tin of cookies and a knowing look in her eyes. "I remember fighting the HOA for months just to get a small railing installed," she said. "If you boys need anything, you tell me." Next came Jordan, a young father pushing a stroller, who offered bottles of cold water. "I didn't understand what the ramp was for," he admitted. "But now I do." Keanu accepted the support with a quiet nod. He didn't ask for an audience, but the neighborhood had made itself one. By midday, a semicircle of curious onlookers had gathered, some supportive, some skeptical, some simply nosy. Their murmurs filled the air, blending with the sound of saws and drills. But inevitably, the HOA's disruption arrived. Margaret stormed down the street like a thunderclap, her expression carved from stone. Trevor followed at her side, armed with a camera, documenting every angle of the construction as if building a case. "Mr. Reeves," Margaret snapped, "you have been explicitly instructed to discontinue this project." She pointed to Nolan. "And you, sir, are in violation of aiding and abetting non-compliant construction." Nolan straightened slowly, unfazed. "Ma'am, I'm helping a neighbor. That's what people used to do before rules meant more than decency." Margaret's nostrils flared. "This ramp is unauthorized. It disrupts the architectural consistency of the neighborhood. It lowers property value. It keeps an elderly woman from falling down her own stairs," Keanu interrupted, his voice still calm but edged with unmistakable firmness. The crowd fell silent. Even Margaret hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the simplicity of the truth. But she recovered quickly, pulling out yet another notice from her folder. "Compassion does not override policy, Mr. Reeves. If you continue, the HOA will proceed with legal escalation. Fines, liens, potential litigation." The threat hung heavy in the air. At that moment, a soft voice called from across the street. "He's building it for me." All heads turned. Eleanor, sitting in her wheelchair on her porch, had gathered enough strength to speak louder than usual. She looked fragile under the afternoon sun, but her eyes carried resolve. "I didn't ask him to do it. He offered, "Because I can't get down these steps without someone lifting me." The neighborhood absorbed her words like a collective blow. Some residents looked ashamed, others looked furious, just not at Keanu. Margaret stiffened, her rigid certainty cracking for the first time. Trevor lowered his camera slowly. The silence swelled until Nolan finally broke it. If this neighborhood has room for flower beds shaped like flamingos and neon-lit patios, it has room for a ramp that keeps a good woman safe. A few neighbors nodded, then a few more. The balance of the street was shifting, not loudly, not chaotically, but undeniably. Margaret sensed the tide turning, and for the first time, she stepped back. Not defeated, just momentarily uncertain. She turned sharply and marched away, Trevor scrambling behind her. Keanu exhaled, shoulders loosening. He glanced at Eleanor, who gave him a faint, grateful smile. Then he looked at Nolan and the small group of supportive neighbors. "Thank you," he said quietly. "All of you." Nolan shrugged. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got a ramp to finish." The neighborhood watched as the two men got back to work, this time not alone, but with a quiet army of witnesses who finally understood what the HOA never bothered to see. The sun dipped low on the horizon as the final board slid into place. The ramp, once a scattered pile of lumber, now stretched from Eleanor's porch to her driveway in a smooth, gentle slope, sturdy, sanded, reinforced, sealed, and beautiful in its simplicity. It didn't stand out like an eyesore. It blended, warm cedar tones matching the porch, railings curved with care, each screw placed with purpose. It wasn't just functional, it was crafted with a kind of intention only compassion can fuel. Keanu stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, as Nolan tightened the last bolt. "There," the old carpenter said, patting the railing. "She's solid, strong enough to last longer than any of us." Keanu smiled, exhaustion melting into relief. The work was done, despite the fines, despite the warnings, despite the HOA's threats. Neighbors gathered quietly on the street, drawn by the sense that something important had just happened. They weren't here out of curiosity anymore. They were here out of respect. Mrs. Delgado clutched her hands together, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Jordan, holding his toddler, whispered, "This is what a neighborhood is supposed to look like." Even some of the more skeptical residents softened as they studied the ramp, not as a violation, but as a solution. And then, from the corner of their vision, the moment everyone had been waiting for, Eleanor being wheeled toward the ramp, her eyes glistening with disbelief. She stopped at the top, looking down the gentle decline that had once been a barrier she feared daily. "May I try?" she whispered. Keanu nodded. "It's yours, Eleanor." She placed her hands on the wheels and pushed forward gently. The wheelchair rolled smoothly, the wooden surface steady beneath her. There was no wobble, no sudden drop, no fear, just freedom. She reached the bottom effortlessly, her breath catching in her chest. I did that myself," she said softly, almost bewildered. The neighbors broke into applause, genuine, warm, unforced. Keanu walked beside her, his expression tender. Nolan stood on the porch, arms crossed proudly, nodding like a craftsman satisfied with his work. Eleanor reached up, grasped Keanu's hand, and whispered through trembling lips, "Thank you for giving me back something I thought I'd lost." But the moment couldn't stay untouched for long. A familiar pair of heels clicked down the sidewalk. Margaret appeared, Trevor trailing behind her with a notepad, though this time his posture was hesitant. She stopped at the edge of the crowd, staring at the ramp as if it were an unwanted guest at her dinner table. "Mr. Reeves," she said, though the authority in her voice wavered, "you proceeded with construction despite our explicit orders. The HOA will need to." She stopped, because for the first time, she looked directly at Eleanor, really looked. Not as a checkbox on a ledger, not as a violation statistic, but as a fragile woman in a wheelchair who had just experienced her first independent descent in years. Eleanor lifted her chin. "This ramp keeps me safe, Margaret. It keeps me from falling. It lets me go to my appointments without needing half the neighborhood to lift me. If this breaks your rules, then your rules are broken." The street fell silent. Margaret blinked, thrown off balance by a truth she couldn't bureaucratize. Even Trevor lowered his notepad, guilt settling across his shoulders. Margaret drew a breath, preparing to argue, but Nolan stepped forward, his voice steady and unyielding. "You can tear up every violation notice you wrote today," he said, "because if you try to remove that ramp, half this neighborhood will stand on it before you lay a hand on it." Several neighbors murmured agreements, forming a protective semicircle around the ramp, around Eleanor. For the first time since the conflict began, Margaret wasn't just outnumbered, she was outmatched by the one thing HOA bylaws could never control: collective decency. She stiffened, realizing the battle was lost. Without another word, she turned and walked away, Trevor following slowly, no longer filming. When they were gone, the tension lifted like a cloud finally passing. Keanu exhaled, his shoulders dropping. Eleanor reached for his hand again. "You didn't just build a ramp," she said softly. "You built a way for me to live again." He smiled. "You deserve that, Eleanor." As the last light of day faded, Keanu stood on her porch, looking at the ramp bathed in gold. It wasn't grand or flashy. It wasn't a movie moment. It was something far better: quiet kindness made real. And in a neighborhood ruled by paperwork and policy, this small act of humanity had rewritten the unspoken rules. Silvercrest Estates wasn't perfect yet, but tonight, because of a ramp and a few brave neighbors, it felt a little more like a community. And for Keanu, that was worth every argument, every fine, every threat, because compassion had won, and everyone could see it.